Welcome back. Today we are drawing the Romantic poet William Wordsworth. Just grab a pencil and follow along. William Wordsworth was a famous English poet who played a central role in the English Romantic movement. He is best known for ushering in the Romantic age in English literature with the joint publication of Lyrical Ballads with Samuel Taylor Coleridge in 1798. He was born in Lake District, a region in northwest England, known for its beautiful lakes, mountains, and forests. He had a deep sense of love and appreciation for nature which was cultivated early in his life. His love for nature profoundly influenced both his personality and work. William Wordsworth was taught poetry by his father John Wordsworth, who also let his son read extensively from his own father's library. He began his writing career by publishing a sonnet in The European magazine. He later published his poetry collections An Evening Walk and descriptive sketches. Wordsworth's meeting and his subsequent friendship with Samuel Taylor Coleridge is believed to be one of the most important happenings in the poet's life. Wordsworth and Coleridge together produced Lyrical Ballads, the first volume of which did not give either's name as the author. Second and third editions were soon published which included a preface to the poems. This preface to Lyrical Ballads is considered to be one of the most important works of the English Romantic movement. His other famous works include Poems, in 2 volumes, Guide to the Lakes, The Excursion, and The Prelude. Even though a prolific poet, Wordsworth wrote only one play, The Borderers, a tragedy. Wordsworth, inspired by his friend Coleridge, had grand ambitions to write an epic philosophical poem titled The Recluse, which he could not complete within his lifetime. Childhood and early life. William Wordsworth was the second of the 5 children born to John Wordsworth and Anne Cookson. John Wordsworth was a legal agent for James Lowther, 1st Earl of Lonsdale, while Anne Cookson was the daughter of a linendraper. He had 3 brothers, Richard, John, and Christopher, and 1 sister, Dorothy. He was the closest to his sister with whom he shared an intense and lifelong friendship. As a child, he attended the grammar school near Cockermouth Church and Burkett's School at Penrith. After the death of his mother in 1778, he was sent to Hawkshead Grammar School in Lancashire. His father died in 1783. The untimely deaths of both his parents meant that he was separated from his beloved sister who was sent away to live with relatives. His mother died when he was 8. His father worked as a lawyer to James Lowther, 1st Earl of Lonsdale, a notoriously corrupt man who had earned the local nickname Wicked Jimmy. Career. It was during his stint at Hawkshead Grammar School that young William realized his firm love for poetry. The publication of a sonnet in the European magazine in 1787 launched his career as a poet. While studying at St. John's College in Cambridge, he set out to tour Europe. This experience deeply impacted his interests and sympathies in life, sensitized him to the troubles of the common man, and had an intense influence on his poetry. He published his poetry collections, An Evening Walk and Descriptive Sketches in 1793, further cementing his career. He met the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge in 1795. It was in collaboration with him that the most significant work in the English Romantic movement, Lyrical Ballads, was produced in 1798. At the peak of his career, he published Poems, in 2 volumes, in 1807. He published Guide to the Lakes in 1810 followed by The Excursion, in 1814 and Laodamia, in 1815. The Prelude, generally considered to be Wordsworth's masterpiece, is an autobiographical poem which was published posthumously in 1850. Major works. Lyrical Ballads, published with Samuel Taylor Coleridge in 1798, remains one of his major works till date. The poems in themselves are some of the most influential in Western literature, but the poet's views as expressed in the preface to the 2nd edition hold the honor of being the most important work of the English Romantic movement. The Prelude, had not even been given a title at the time of Wordsworth's death. It was the product of a lifetime he had been working on from the time he was 28. It was ultimately named and published by his widow Mary 3 months after his death. Personal life and legacy. As a student, he toured France and fell in love with a French woman, Annette Vallon, with whom he had a daughter, Caroline. Even though he did not marry Annette, he did his best to support his daughter. In 1802, he married his childhood friend Mary Hutchinson. The couple had 5 children, 3 of whom predeceased their father. His sister Dorothy lived with him throughout his life. After the death of his daughter Dora in 1847, the devastated father stopped writing poetry completely. William Wordsworth died after a short illness on April 23, 1850. Wordsworth's major legacy was the introduction of a new attitude towards nature as he introduced nature imagery into his work, and presented a fresh view of the relationship between man and the natural world. As a poet, Wordsworth delved deeply into his own sensibilities as he traced the growth of a poet's mind in his autobiographical poem, The Prelude. Wordsworth not only created some of the finest poetry of his times, but he also placed poetry at the center of human existence, pronouncing it to be as immortal as the heart of man. Trivia. The Prelude was intended by the poet to be an introduction to a long philosophical poem, The Recluse, which he never finished in his lifetime. In 1792, he met John Walking Stewart, an English traveler and philosopher who had a major influence on his poetry. He and his friends Coleridge and Robert Southey came to be known as the Lake Poets. He succeeded Southey as Britain's Poet Laureate in 1843 and held that post until his death in 1850. 9 things you didn't know about William Wordsworth. Number 1. Wordsworth was separated from his sister, Dorothy. After the death of their mother in 1778, William and Dorothy were torn apart by their father, who sent them to live with different relatives, and Wordsworth ended up in Penrith. They didn't see each other for the next 9 years, despite having been so close as children. After being reunited, they made up for lost time by spending many of the next few decades living and traveling together, even taking trips to France and Germany. Number 2. Wordsworth only spent 8 years living at Dove Cottage. Have you ever found yourself wondering, where did William Wordsworth live? We're here to tell you there is more than one historic home of the famous poets located in the Lake District. Born at Wordsworth House, Wordsworth lived in France and Germany for a time during the French Revolution, eventually finding himself homesick for the glorious rugged countryside of the Lake District. Returning home in December 1799, Wordsworth and his sister moved into the quintessential Dove Cottage, where they lived until 1808, over 40 years before his death. Considered to be one of the most memorable homes he had, there are in fact others that are open to the public for viewing. If you've already heard of Dove Cottage, then you might not have heard of Rydal Mount, where Wordsworth lived from 1813 until his death, just over 2 miles from the town of Ambleside. Number 3. Wordsworth is considered the father of the Romantics. Coined towards the end of the 18th century, the Romantic era is widely seen as having been started by poets William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who co-wrote the poetry collection Lyrical Ballads, which is said to have changed the perception of how poetry should be written. With Romanticism came a new age and approach to poetry writing which brought us some of the greats we've come to know and love. Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, Shelley, Byron, Blake. I could go on. As Wordsworth said, poetry should begin as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. This style of writing can be found throughout many of his best-known works, particularly his most famous poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. Number 4. I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud wasn't entirely written by Wordsworth. More commonly known as Daffodils, Wordsworth's most famous poem is considered to be "I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud." This lyric poem was inspired by a walk Wordsworth took with his sister Dorothy, where they came across a field of yellow daffodils on the shores of Glencoyne Bay at Ullswater. The poem itself was written 2 years after the fact, but what you didn't know was 2 of its famous lines, often mentioned in the school curriculum, weren't in fact written by Wordsworth. They flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. The lines above were added by Wordsworth's childhood friend and future wife, Mary Hutchinson. So while you may have spent your high school years analyzing the meaning behind Wordsworth's inward eye, it was actually his wife's stroke of genius. More interestingly, Wordsworth often found inspiration for his poetry by reading from Dorothy's journal, in which she kept detailed accounts of her explorations through nature. Dorothy is now considered to be a writer herself because of this, and many of her journals can be read at Dove Cottage. Number 5. William Wordsworth was Poet Laureate of England for 7 years. Holding the title of Poet Laureate of the whole of England is impressive in itself. What makes it more unbelievable was he maintained the title until his death despite not writing a single verse during that time. Considering himself too old for the title and responsibility, Wordsworth initially declined the offer to be Poet Laureate but was assured by the Prime Minister at the time, Robert Peel, that there would be no expectation of him to write further. William Wordsworth's Poet Laureate status was taken entirely on his previous merit as a writer. Wordsworth did continue to write personally, but no further work of his was ever published, and he officially gave it up in 1847. After the death of his daughter. Number 6. Wordsworth's best-known work, The Prelude, was published after his death. William Wordsworth's death was reported to be in April 1850 due to a condition called pleurisy, an inflammation of the membrane surrounding the lungs and chest cavity. He spent many of the aforementioned years adding to this autobiographical poem, but never got the chance to show it to the world before his death. Published 3 months after his death, it was the first time the public became aware such a poem had been in progress. It was his widow Mary who eventually gave the poem its famous name, as Wordsworth himself hadn't decided what to call it. Wordsworth originally dedicated The Prelude as an autobiographical poem to Coleridge, whom he had a tricky relationship with for many years due to the latter's opium addiction. Its unofficial name is Poem to Coleridge. Number 7. Wordsworth had a child with Frenchwoman Annette Vallon. During the French Revolution, Wordsworth visited France, where he met Frenchwoman Annette Vallon and fathered a daughter, Caroline, a fact only later discovered by scholars in the early 20th century. Because of financial issues he was forced to return to England, though he did his best to provide financial stability for his daughter. Many years later he returned to France for a visit with the company of his sister Dorothy to meet his daughter and announced to Annette his forthcoming marriage to childhood sweetheart Mary. Number 8. Mike Myers is a descendant of William Wordsworth. One thing that's sure to blow your mind is that famous actor Mike Myers is actually related to Wordsworth. Yes, that's right, the Canadian-born actor, best known for his iconic portrayal of Austin Powers, is in fact Wordsworth's first cousin, 7 times removed. Number 9. Wordsworth suffered many losses during his life. One of the Lake District's most famous homes is of course, Wordsworth House. Born in April 1770, the English poet spent most of his early life at Wordsworth House, Cockermouth, with his 4 siblings. If you're an enthusiastic literary lover, then spending Wordsworth's 250th birthday at his childhood home could just be the perfect way to celebrate. Offering a look into how the famous poet grew up in this fine Georgian home. Contrary to many of his poems, which were full of powerful, tranquil feelings, Wordsworth's life wasn't all sunshine and daffodils. Losing his mother in 1778 and his father 5 years later, the Wordsworth children were left orphaned. Split apart with his beloved sister, Wordsworth spent 9 years apart from his best friend and confidant Dorothy, before finally being reunited when they reached adulthood. In 1805, one of his siblings John died after going out to sea, whilst two of Wordsworth's children died between 1811 to 1812, aged 6 and 3. If you've been watching this far, consider subscribing, it's free. Give it a thumbs up. Feel free to leave a comment, share your thoughts. Yes, I do read them. Still 4 minutes. I'm out of words. Oh, that's gonna be a long video. If you haven't already, follow us on other social media. I'll put the link in the description. If you want to support this channel financially, we do have Patreon. Even $1 can make a difference. Until next time, take care and do good.